Today, in an echo of the September report that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson referred to President Trump as a moron in a meeting at the Pentagon after the president left that meeting, BuzzFeed reported that National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster referred to Donald Trump as an idiot in private conversation. And so today was one of those typical days in Washington when if you're allowed to shout just one question in the president's direction, you have to decide. Is it going to be about him being an idiot, or is it going to be about the thing that Donald Trump fears talking about more than anything else?
Your thoughts on Roy Moore, Mr. President? Do you believe his accusers? Do you believe Roy Moore's accusers, Mr. President?
Thank you very much.
The president is now saying exactly what Steve Bannon wants him to say, according to a Daily Beast report that says that Bannon has spoken to the president by phone and discouraged, quote, the president from rejecting or criticizing Moore in public statements. And so Donald Trump says absolutely nothing. Of course, any answer Donald Trump might have given today to a Roy Moore question would have provoked a mandatory follow-up question about Donald Trump's own now public admission that he has himself been guilty of sexual assault. When the Washington Post broke its story about Roy Moore 11 days ago, the most horrifying and criminal aspect of the story, reported by the Washington Post, is what happened to Leigh Corfman when she was 14 years old, and Roy Moore was a 32-year-old assistant district attorney. Today, Leigh Corfman did her first television interview about this with Savannah Guthrie on the Today Show.
He took me to his home. After arriving at his home, on the second occasion that I went with him, he basically laid out some blankets on the floor of his living room and proceeded to seduce me, I guess you would say. And during the course of that, he removed my clothing. He left the room and came back in wearing his white underwear. And he touched me over my clothing, what was left of it. And he tried to get me to touch him as well. And at that point, I pulled back and said that I was not comfortable, and I got dressed, and he took me home. But I was a 14-year-old child trying to play in an adult's world, and he was 32 years old.
How do you think that interaction affected your life?
Well, it took away a lot of the specialness of, interactions with men. It took some trust away. It allowed me to delve into some things that I wouldn't have otherwise. It took years for me to regain a sense of confidence in myself, and I felt guilty. I felt like I was the one that was to blame, and it was decades before I was able to let that go.
A couple of things. Roy Moore denies these allegations and further says he does not even know you.
I wonder how many me's he doesn't know.
Leigh Corfman said that she told family and friends about what happened to her years ago, told them years ago, and that as Roy Moore became more publicly prominent as an elected judge in Alabama, she thought about confronting him.
My children were small. I was a single parent. And when you're in that situation, you do everything you can to protect your own. And I sat in the courtroom, in the courthouse parking lot, and thought, I'm going in, I'm going to confront him.
Years later,
and
you thought about it.
This is like 2000, 2001. And I wanted to walk into his office and say, hey, remember me? You need to knock this stuff off. I need to go public. My children were small, so I didn't do it.
Savannah Guthrie's last question to Leigh Corfman was political.
And one final question for those who might be watching thinking, what are your politics?
My politics? Well, I've voted as a Republican for years and years and years. But this isn't political for me. This is personal.
This weekend, Alabama's three largest newspapers, which are all part of the Alabama Media Group, published an editorial urging voters to reject Roy Moore's candidacy by voting for the Democratic candidate for Senate, Doug Jones, in the December 12th special election. The editorial said Doug Jones has built a platform around issues that will define Alabama: job creation, small business development, child health care, criminal justice reform, and perhaps most needed of all, compromise. For us, his pro-choice stance is not disqualifying. What is disqualifying is the conduct of Roy Moore against women and children. In an article today, AL.com points out that Roy Moore first had his eye on the woman he eventually married when she was 15 or 16 years old. Here is how Roy Moore has told that story himself in his own words.
We met, well, actually, when I was the deputy district attorney, many years before we got married. I saw her at a dance recital, and I was standing, at the back of the auditorium, and I saw her up front. And I remember her name. It was Kayla Kisor.
According to the reporting at AL.com, that dance recital occurred when Kayla was 15 or 16 years old.
It was, 8 years later or something, I met her, and when she told me her name, I remembered KK. And I said, haven't I met you before? Of course, she was younger. She says, I don't think so. And she brushed it off. So it was strange because I remembered that many years later when I saw her.
The AL.com reports today points out that what is really so strange about it was that Roy Moore is the part that Roy Moore does not seem to understand. Here is a grown man at about 30 years old attending a girls' dance recital and doing what exactly? Joining us now, Tom Bates, president of Alabama Media Group and an editorial board member for AL.com. Also with us, Jennifer Rubin, a conservative opinion writer at the Washington Post, and Ron Klain, former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, and a former senior aide to President Obama. And Tom Bates, I want to talk about a couple of things in your newspapers. First of all, this extraordinary editorial. Is this the first time you've endorsed a Democrat in a race like this?
You know, Lawrence, we have a tradition, actually, of picking a Republican presidential candidate. We did endorse Hillary Clinton over President Trump. But frankly, we're not typically in the endorsement business. It's something that we usually stay out of. But our feeling is that this is a unique moment in time, and we had to take a stand.
And I want to ask you also about the television interviews that we've now seen. Last week, Beverly Young Nelson became the first accuser of Roy Moore to do a television interview. The others had been quoted and told their stories in print in the Washington Post. And I'm wondering about the different impact that television has and what Leigh Corfman, now appearing publicly on the Today Show this morning, what different impact that might have in Alabama.
It's a great question. You know, I think, Lawrence, it's going to get down to whether this Senate race ends up being about party politics or not. You know, our feeling is it has to transcend that. This is a referendum on what we expect from our leaders. And frankly, I don't know how we can expect our children to have faith in the government and other institutions if we allow sexual abuse to be something that's pushed to the side. So I'm not sure how people will react. The Republicans in the state are sticking by Moore. I think a lot of people have soul searching to do right now between now and the election. I do think the majority of Alabamians do not hold the same views as Roy Moore, but it's very possible some will look the other way.
Jennifer Rubin, you see Roy Moore telling the story of his wife and meeting his wife, and it is more complicated than most stories about how I met my wife. And so he seems so comfortable with the idea that he met her so many years before when she was 15 or 16 years old in high school in a dance recital.
Yeah, I mean, if he, frankly, if he was so candid about that, I'm surprised he wasn't candid about the 14-year-old. This is obviously a man who is very much attracted to very young, very defenseless, very innocent young girls with, as we heard from his victim, one of his victims, with really dire consequences for them. You know, it was interesting that Tom talks about transcending politics. Today we also heard from Kellyanne Conway, who happens to be a mother, who happens to be a senior advisor to the President of the United States. And what does she say? She says we need Roy Moore's vote for the tax bill. So imagine that. Imagine that kind of calculus in someone's mind. We need the accused pederasts vote to give tax cuts to millionaires. That's what we're dealing with. And I would hope that he's right, that the good people of Alabama think twice about this, that they don't want to disgrace themselves and their state, that they say enough. Not everything is about partisan politics.
Yeah, Kellyanne Conway was on Fox News this morning, and Brian Kilmeade, one of the hosts of the show, pressed her on this. Was she advocating voting for Roy Moore? He did it twice. She finally says to her, so vote for Roy Moore, to which Kellyanne Conway says, I'm telling you that we want the votes in the Senate to get this tax bill through. And Ron Klain, that this Alabama election could seriously affect that.
It could, Lawrence. I mean, it's a shame, as Jennifer alluded to, if corporate tax cuts mean more than child molestation, which is kind of what Kellyanne Conway's formula was on Fox today. And it's amazing that our president, who has a view on everything from how we should respond to the national anthem to what restaurant has the best taco salad, can't formulate a view on Roy Moore and whether or not it's appropriate for a child molester to be put in the Senate. And so, you know, it's no surprise, as you said, that he's trying to hide on that because it leads back to a conversation about Donald Trump. But what we're seeing plainly is just that the Trump White House will stop at nothing to dodge this question and to but try to push quietly for Moore's election to the Senate.
And Tom Bates, it seemed just a week ago that Kellyanne Conway agreed with you editorially on this. Let's listen to what she said just last week.
Whatever the facts end up being, the premise is, of course, the principle, the incontrovertible principle, is that there's no Senate seat that's worth more than a child.
And Tom Bates, now as the tax bill vote seems to get tighter and more difficult in the Senate, the new position is we really have to get this tax bill.
You know, I think, Lawrence, fortunately in Alabama, we don't care to be told what to do. Even President Trump, who is very popular in the state, was not able to get Luther Strange chosen as the candidate in the you know what I'm saying. So that makes me look and think, you know, can we all look inside ourselves and figure out what is the right thing to do? So it's more a question of who folks are aligning with as a party more than any specific issues, I believe, at this time.
And Jennifer, Steve Bannon having the president's ear on this, and apparently the agreement of Kellyanne Conway that do not say one public word against Roy Moore.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Saturday Night Live routine where it's President Bannon who's actually pulling the strings here. I think, listen, Trump has two problems. One, his own past, where he has even more accusers than Roy Moore does. It's a unenviable record. And secondly, that if the people of Alabama do the opposite, he will once again be shown to be impotent. They didn't follow his advice on Luther Strange, and if they don't follow his advice here, he is going to be revealed to be less than all-powerful. And I think that frightens him probably as much as the revelations about his own past.
And Ron Klain, here is this crucially important Senate election, special election, and the President of the United States is not in Alabama campaigning for the Republican.
Yeah, I mean, he's hiding under his desk in the Oval Office trying to avoid questions. It's going to be a long time. December 12th is close, but not that close, and I don't know how Trump can dodge these questions for the next 2 weeks. But he clearly has been taken off the playing field in this critical special election. It could really decide the outcome of his legislative agenda, Lawrence. I mean, they've lost a couple Republican senators. They have others teetering on the brink. This senator could be the deciding vote on this giant corporate tax cut, this giant giveaway to rich people, and Trump is just unable to talk about it because of his personal problems and because of the horror of having to back a candidate who his own daughter said there was a special place in hell for people like this kind of person.
Tom Bates, quickly before we go, is there any kind of tax debate going on in this Senate campaign?
You know, there is in Alabama. I think people are very in touch with the current issues. And again, you know, Trump has a lot of support in Alabama. But you know, this is a special time. I think we're going above and beyond that. And I think we have to remember, too, in the case of Roy Moore, even before these women stepped forward, he had a number of issues. He's been thrown off the Alabama bench twice. He said some very controversial things about people who are different than himself, Muslims, gays, and so forth. So that has overwhelmed the debate. It's very much a debate about Roy Moore. Doug Jones has run a very quiet campaign, very focused on issues, I think, that are most closely tied to people's daily lives and their pocketbooks. You know, we'll see if he's able to fight through the discussion.
Tom Bates, thank you very much for joining us tonight from Alabama. Really appreciate it. Coming up, the emails that the special prosecutor Robert Mueller wants and what those emails might tell us about where that investigation is going, and the report today that National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster referred to Donald Trump as an idiot and other words like dope and kindergartner. Did that at a private dinner, according to one report. That's coming up.